I purchased Dark Souls when it was released in 2011, and found it to be much too difficult. As a middle schooler, I had loved fantasy games like Dragon Age Origins, but Dark Souls was different, and I wasn't ready for it. After my initial struggle with the series, I wouldn't try it again until Bloodborne was released in 2015, at which point I fell in love with the difficult combat and fluent world design that the series has since become known for. I moved on to Dark Souls 1 and 2 in rapid succession and excitedly awaited the release of the much anticipated Dark Souls 3 in 2016. If I was hooked before, I was completely enamored with the franchise at this point. The creative boss fights, immense amount of build variety, and consistently stunning level and world designs were enough to pull me in more than any series beforehand. This level of hype was met and exceeded in 2019 with the release of Sekiro, a game that I believe managed to perfect action combat, albeit at the cost of build variety. Then, we jump forward a few more years, through a pandemic, and come out the other end with Elden Ring. I have played through the game 3 times. Each of these playthroughs was drastically different from the others, but each one left me feeling a mixture of wonder and frustration. It's undoubtedly another instant classic to be added to From Software's brilliant lineup of genre-defining video games, but it's also got enormous problems. In spite of those problems, Elden Ring is their biggest smash hit by a long shot. Demon's Souls sold 1 million copies. Dark Souls 1 sold 5.5 million. Dark Souls 2 sold 2.5 million. Dark Souls 3 sold 10 million. Bloodborne sold 2 million, and Sekiro sold 5 million. Now, add in their most recent smash hit. Elden Ring came out only a few months ago, and the others have been out for years. The success of Elden Ring is enormous and undeniable. However, I find myself going back to those words that I used to describe my time with Elden Ring and can't help but wonder how my favorite game series has culminated in a product that has the most triumphant moments of exploration that I've ever experienced in a game, and is at the same time marred by equally poignant moments of frustration and dissatisfaction. I will break this video into a few different sections, although forgive me if they blur the lines a bit. With a game as interconnected as this one, sometimes different aspects are difficult to separate entirely. So is Elden Ring a masterpiece? Yes, absolutely, but it's a tarnished one. So that's kind of a lot to unpack. I want to start by re-emphasizing that I truly adored Elden Ring throughout my time with it. I think that it has one of the most compelling open worlds that has ever been crafted in a game, and that it's truly remarkably well put together. The care that FromSoft has put into their world design is the most masterful thing about the game in my opinion, though this excellence came with trade-offs elsewhere, as I will discuss shortly. For now though, let's focus on the world design. In a lot of open-world games, locations feel as though they're placed along the map because there needed to be a city somewhere, and that seemed like as good a spot as any. In Elden Ring, though, every one of the major locations feels as though its placement in the world was given immense thought. Castles constantly dominate the skyline, giant turtles shake the ground around you, an enormous golden tree hangs over the world as a constant beacon of motivation. Stormvale, for example, operates as a sort of bottleneck through which any travelers of Limgrave must venture, unless of course they find the shortcut around the eastern side of it. The transition from Limgrave into Stormvale feels incredibly natural and fits onto the map like a puzzle piece. While this may not sound like anything particularly special, there's just something intangible and satisfying about the way that the open world blends right into the castle. Later on, the capital city of Leyndell is not only one of the most intricate levels to explore, but also feels brilliantly placed at the center of the world and right near the Erdtree, where the player has almost certainly been trying to reach for the entirety of their playthrough. The underground sections, Siofra, Nokron, Nokstella, Lake of Rot, etc., are also placed well enough in the world to feel like magical experiences the first time through. I can't believe I'm saying that I actually enjoyed one of FromSoft's dreaded toxic swamps. Even some of the levels that were disconnected from the world at large made sense in their own right. A level like Crumbling Faramazula, one of my very favorites in the game, would feel strange if connected to the map itself. Though the game never really explains why it's in the middle of nowhere, I like to think that it was once connected to Leyndell before a storm came and swept it out to sea. Obviously, there may be no lore evidence to support this, but I think that it's a cool concept if nothing else, and freedom to imagine is part of what makes From's world so compelling to explore. I'm sure this will be no surprise to anyone who has played the game, but my very favorite entrance into a level is through the crater that's made after defeating Radahn. Seeing the meteor that Radahn had been holding back crash into the earth during that cutscene and then learning, hours later, that it had actually made a meaningful impact on the world is a level of attention to detail that is nearly unfathomable to me. This sort of thing happens a few other times throughout the game with the Erd Tree in Lanedell, but this is the first time we see our actions have a direct impact on the lands between. Very few games, if any, have a moment as powerful as this one. We are having an impact on the world around us, and this crater proves it. This moment becomes even more insane when you realize where it leads, deep into the underground and into the ancient eternal city of Nokron, which towers over Siofra River, an area we had previously explored. For me, this level of world design harkens back to what made Dark Souls 1 so incredibly special. The world feels like a real place that is put together in a meaningful and logical way, and we get to put the pieces of the puzzle together as we explore it. Even more so, our actions have tangible effects on the world itself. This is just genius level game design and makes the player's actions feel incredibly meaningful to the lands between. These early levels are some of the greatest in gaming and deserve to be praised to no end. Unfortunately, there are plenty of others that do not meet this standard. In fact, a few of them are so bad that they barely even meet the standard of those games whose major locations are placed seemingly at random. There are two major areas that come to mind that were so close to achieving that same feeling as Nokron, but whose access points leave a considerable amount to be desired. The first instance of this is Miquella's Halig Tree, one of the most visually stunning levels in the game. This one is accessed via a teleporter in the consecrated snowfield, and while it is given a puzzle to at least make getting there a bit more challenging and interesting, it still leaves me feeling a bit sad at the missed opportunity. Imagine this instead. You're wandering around the consecrated snowfield after having found two secret medallions that let you access it in the first place. During your exploration, you come to a giant turtle mausoleum that rains magic on you from above, and see, behind it, a church which throughout your exploration of the world have provided very useful items. Eventually, after triumphing and making it to the church, you aren't met with any meaningful upgrades this time, but rather a secret passage, one that leads down the mountainside until eventually connecting to one of the taller and larger branches of the tree itself. The player could then be challenged to walk down a dangerous and difficult platforming section along the branches, similar to how they already do when teleported there. Some people don't like these platforming levels, but they're so prevalent in the series at this point that I'm willing to accept them as part of the formula that makes the game so fun to explore, especially because it's made considerably better in this game with the addition of a designated jump. Everything is trying to defeat us, not just the enemies, but the world itself too. Anyway, would this not be a better way to reward the player's curiosity and exploration than with a seemingly meaningless and random teleporter? Honestly, I think the developers intended to do this, but ran out of time because there's even a quest within the game with a woman named Latenna. We promised to take her to the Apostate Derelict, which is the church behind the magic-firing turtle mausoleum, because she wishes to get to the Halig Tree herself. Think about that for a second. There's an NPC who wants to get to the Halig Tree, and we complete the quest by taking her to this church, not the teleporter that we access the Halig Tree through. Additionally, this is the only turtle mausoleum in the game that shoots magic at you, and seems to be guarding a place by doing so. If they allowed you to descend to the tree in the way that I laid out earlier, it would not only make getting to the tree a better experience, but it would also make this quest feel more impactful too. I mean, think about how much less remarkable the journey into Siofra would feel if instead of a long elevator ride that makes you increasingly curious as you descend deeper and deeper into the ground would be if you were simply teleported there instead. It would take away all of the tension, all of the curiosity, all of the payoff when you finally made it to the bottom and got to see that amazing view from the beginning of the level. This exact type of missed opportunity can be seen with Mohg's Palace, which is accessed through a random teleporter also in the consecrated snowfield. This location is first shown to you in the Siofra River, and left me wondering about it throughout the rest of my playthrough until I stumbled upon a teleporter dozens of hours later that took me there. I can't help but feel that this location deserved a much better entrance after the introduction it was given in Siofra. I mean, look at how glorious and intriguing it looks from down here. Being teleported there for the first time removes so much of that curiosity that I had after seeing it floating up near the ceiling of this massive cave. I am no longer amazed by how well it fits into the world. Rather, I feel disappointed by the fact that I never got that payoff of stumbling into a cave and eventually descending deeper and deeper until I find myself in that huge temple I saw all those hours ago. I know how ridiculous it may sound to ask for more content in an already enormous game, but I can't help but feel that these late game transitions left me yearning for the wonder that Stormveil and Nokron instilled in me. The game's world is truly incredible, but the later sections don't come even close to the same quality as the earlier ones. Now that the large-scale levels are out of the way, let's discuss some of the smaller-scale dungeons that are scattered throughout the world. I was legitimately amazed at how many of these there were to be found in Limgrave and the Weeping Peninsula. However, these really seem to tail off as the game progresses. In fact, by the time you reach the mountaintop of the giants, it feels as though there are almost none to explore at all. To be honest, I don't necessarily think that this is a bad thing because of how copy and pasted they all feel in the first place. They are almost unanimously filled with the same gray corridors, the same frustrating enemies, and the same boring puzzle to solve before unlocking one of a number of reused bosses. There are of course a few exceptions to this disappointing rule, such as Jail Cave and Lakeside Crystal Cave, but they aren't enough to make up for the repetition that plagues much of this game's world. The contrast between my playthroughs can be seen again here. My first character explored everything in the world, including nearly all of these miniature dungeons. My first playthrough, they were relatively interesting, although they began to become tedious and repetitive near the end of the game. However, my second playthrough of the game, I explored almost none of them, or at least explored only the ones that I knew provided useful benefits to my character's build. This left my second character with almost no upgrade materials for my weapons because most of them are found in the mini dungeons. The problem wasn't that I couldn't go through the levels, the problem was that their novelty had been worn too thin and my motivation to explore them all but completely diminished. Ultimately, my feelings toward them are incredibly mixed because of these contrasting experiences. On one hand, I did find them sort of interesting the first time through though, because I was always curious to see what reward would be awaiting me at the end. However, they didn't do nearly a good enough job of creating variety in those catacombs, nor does the reward system entice me to venture back into them on repeat playthroughs, except for specific items that pertain to my character, and the bosses found at the end of them, which rarely provide enough value to make my time worth it. I don't think that this is inherently a bad thing. In fact, it could be a benefit to the game that I don't have to explore every single cave on every single playthrough, because as I already stated, this game is enormous. But at the same time, I can't help but see my genuine disinterest in returning to most of them as a negative. I think that the developers realize this and may be part of why their occurrence dwindles near the end of the game, although the end of the game feels too empty and repetitive as a result. The mountaintop of the giants and consecrated snowfield specifically. I mean, if players don't want to return to them on the second playthrough, it's entirely possible too that they will be burned out of looking at the same catacomb walls by the end of their first playthrough. The sheer size of the game may also be responsible in large part for the shortcomings in world cohesion and connectivity. As the world got larger, it probably became increasingly more difficult to connect things in that way, especially with the clock ticking down before release. In this way, Elden Ring's sheer magnitude may be its own largest detriment. I think that these problems mostly arise upon returning to the game after the first playthrough, and I don't want to judge the game too harshly for being less replayable, because in nearly all cases the first playthrough is the most important, but I still need to point them out as problems. I want to add here that I don't think the dungeons become too stale at the end of the game, just the open world. As I have already stated, the last 3 legacy dungeons that players are likely to encounter, Lanedell, Farum Azula, and Haligtree, are some of the best in the game. This points to the open world becoming the problem of levels near the end of the game, and hey, for a first attempt at an open world, From Software did a pretty amazing job. They already solved the main problem most open world games have, making the world interesting enough to justify exploring it. I just wish the amazing world design that made the first half of the game such a remarkable experience hadn't fallen off so drastically near the end of the game. So, if the world is genuinely such a monumental achievement for the most part, especially on first playthroughs, then how is this game still so frustrating? Well, it's got to do with the enemies and bosses that are traditionally the centerpiece of From's games. The most disappointing part is that in spite of the problems with its bosses and enemy variety, Elden Ring has some of the most visually stunning enemies in the entire series. Ancestral Spirit, Radagon of the Golden Order and Elden Beast, Dragonlord Placidusax, and Melania Blade of Miquella to name a few. I mean, if nothing else, the visual feast that this game is truly never ends. That being said though, the game is rife with repeat bosses. I mean, FromSoft has never had a game that had so few entirely unique boss encounters. Don't get me wrong, repeat boss encounters aren't always a bad thing when they're done right. Sometimes they have more advanced movesets, different visuals, or have a distinct purpose for being there multiple times that is related to the story. A good example that covers all 3 of those possibilities is Genichiro from Sekiro. He gets new moves across the 3 times you fight him, including different visuals to go along with them, and he serves an important purpose in the story of the game, while also being meant to show how far you've come with how easy he is as an introductory phase to the final fight. See? Reusing boss fights isn't inherently detrimental. In fact, there's plenty of boss reuse that I think works really well in the game. I think that the dragons, despite being almost identical to one another, are generally a very effective use of the same asset, especially with the addition of Torrent, who we will discuss later. Instead of the tedium that dragon fights are normally full of, we get to feel like a valiant knight riding their steed through the fire and the flames into battle. They feel at home in the lands between, and it makes sense that they would each find their own niche in the world to fit into. Hence why we find a Scarlet Rot Dragon in Caelid, a Magic Dragon in Liurnia, a Frost Dragon in the Consecrated Snowfields, etc. I don't think that the Erdtree avatars are horrible reuses of a boss either. I don't think the Deathbright Birds are bad, or the Knights Cavalry, or the Mariners, or... Do you see a pattern yet? All of these bosses work because they feel like they were designed with the purpose of being placed in multiple spots throughout the world to guard interesting rewards or areas, or to just be a surprise encounter throughout the process of exploration. The Erdtree avatars protect the Flax tiers, the dragons provide hearts that can be sacrificed into spells, and the others often drop various rewards too. My big problem with Elden Ring's reuse of bosses isn't that it occurs at all, it's that they somehow decided it was a good idea to reuse bosses that are the finale of large-scale dungeons. I mean, just listen to some of these. Godric the Grafted, the Elden Lord of Stormvale Castle, is reused in a random Everjail. Astel, Natural Born of the Void, shows up again at the end of a random cave. Regal Ancestor Spirit shows up twice, both times after the same puzzle, etc. The reason that reusing these bosses doesn't work in the way that the others do is because they are very clearly meant to be bombastic, important fights in the game. They don't share the same quality as something like the dragons, Deathbright Birds, or Erdtree avatars because they feel like individuals rather than like one in a set of many. It's not hard to imagine that dragons and Deathbright Birds exist by the dozens throughout the world because they're a species, not an individual. The same cannot be said for Astel, Ancestral Spirit, and Godric, who are all very clearly a single individual, and are also clearly intended as the conclusion of their own respective areas. These are the instances of reuse that make no sense to me, because all they do is retroactively take away from the unique importance of the first fight without adding anything to it whatsoever. I could almost excuse Regal Ancestor Spirit on the rationale that there are multiple altars honoring it and that the fight is ever so slightly different, but reusing the puzzle that unlocks it ruins this moment for me, especially with the fight being as similar as it is. The thing that I find most ironic is that the rematch with Astel is found in an underground cave and is one of the mine shafts that is actually a unique level. So one of the few unique underground levels in the game is then concluded with one of the worst examples of boss reuse. I want to reiterate that of course all boss reuse isn't bad, but reusing bosses that are meant to conclude legacy dungeons or large sections of the game is undoubtedly a bad decision and only retroactively harms those initial encounters. The other main problem I have with the enemy design in this game is the more egregious of the two by far. Too many of them, especially in the latter half of the game, feel completely out of the range of reasonable for these games. I can already hear people telling me to get good, so let me just ask for a moment to explain myself before you judge what I'm saying. All of these games have been predicated on the foundation that the enemies play by largely the same rules as the player. They have a limited moveset, a limited amount of health, and they have windows in between attacks that the player is able to punish by causing damage. This is counteracted by the player being able to invest in more health so that they are capable of making more mistakes before losing the battle, being able to invest in more endurance so that after dodging a series of attacks they can still have enough stamina to punish the boss, or being able to invest into their important damage dealing stat so that their weapons require less swings or casts to take the enemy down. This game's enemy design philosophy ruins a number of these rules that are intended to make boss fights fair and fun. No longer do bosses always provide windows to attack in between their own onslaughts, and, in fact, many of them flip around through the air so much that a melee character has little opportunity to attack whatsoever. This is especially relevant to Malenia, who can, at seemingly any moment, break out into Waterfowl Dance, her own signature move. Keep in mind too, that when she damages you, she heals herself. This means that you are not only risking taking an insane amount of near impossible to avoid damage by risking getting close to attack, but you are also risking healing her when you get caught by it. This breaks all of the rules that the games have had in place to keep the combat feeling fresh, fair, and fun. If I can't feel safe getting close to the boss, then how am I supposed to defeat her without resorting to ranged attacks? Of course, there are people who can do it flawlessly, but for the average player, this fight is ridiculous and not fun in any way. I like to compare her to the most challenging boss in Bloodborne, the Orphan of Kos, because they're both acrobatic, do insane amounts of damage, and are the most difficult fights of their respective games. The difference is in the game's mechanics. Bloodborne feels tuned for a boss as aggressive as Orphan because it allows you to recover any damage that has been recently dealt to you by immediately retaliating. Elden Ring doesn't have anything like this, ironically, until you defeat Malenia and earn her Great Rune. This means that all those moments where you risk taking damage by getting close to her operate solely on the hope that she won't go into Waterfowl Dance, because if she does, there's very little to be done about it. Essentially, the fight incentivizes playing it safe and waiting, rather than perfectly dodging her assaults and punishing her misplays. Look at what happens here when I try to punish her attacks. What even kills me here? Just being too close to her? Instead of feeling like a satisfying dance to victory, it feels like a slow and frustrating grind. This isn't the only boss that breaks combat in this way, making it a waiting game rather than a fun ebb and flow of stamina management and reaction speed, but it is one of the worst and served to make my point perfectly clear. The big problem is not that the fight is too hard, it's that it's no longer any fun. This problem is also prevalent against Elden Beast, Malekith, and Placidusax. Notice that these are all endgame bosses, and while it does make them incredibly cinematic and visually stunning fights, they also become boring and annoying when most of your time is spent evading and waiting for the boss to land. Just to make this point abundantly clear, here's a clip of me fighting Dragon Lord Placidusax. I got him to almost no health. He then flew around and breathed fire magic for over a full minute until I eventually died, to a teleport attack. These teleport attacks, by the way, are terrible because the camera becomes your enemy more than the actual boss. Often, by the time you actually find where the boss went to, you're taking completely unavoidable damage. Placidusax, Radagon, and Astel are all great examples of this, not to mention how much damage these attacks do. The system is no longer fair or fun if everything in the latter half of the game can launch themselves into a combo that will easily melt through someone with 40 plus of their points invested into the health stat. This could theoretically be counteracted by all of the additional content in the game's overworld providing additional levels, but so much of that content provides little to no runes for the players to level up with that farming in the overworld, except in very select spots, is an unreasonably time-consuming task. I explored everything in my first playthrough, and considerably less in my second, but as you can see, their levels really aren't terribly different, despite massive variations in playtime. This is because the majority of levels to be found aren't in the overworld but are in the legacy dungeons. Additionally, this problem is only exacerbated by the limited enemy design in the overworld too. I mean, does it make any sense whatsoever that the enemies in Mountaintop of the Giants are exclusively the same enemies from Caelid? No, because those enemies were made to fit the desolation and disease-ridden swamps that Caelid has been overcome by. Placing them as the main enemies of the Mountaintop of the Giants makes the area feel awful to explore despite the beautiful visuals, and incentivizes players to hop on Torrent and sprint past everything that they see. That's pretty much what I did in my playthrough, and there's no way that I'm the only one. It's not a good sign of success when the player actively wants to avoid combat throughout the exploration of the world because of repetition. This could be another indication that the game's scope got out of control and the developers were unable to maintain a constant level of quality and creativity near the end. But my point is that the game's repetition of common enemy types makes my desire to actively fight things in the open world dwindle considerably, and the small number of runes that most of them provide completely eliminates my motivation entirely. All of this ties back to the fact that players are absolutely required to invest in health if they want to have any chance of fighting these late game bosses, particularly Malenia, Radagon/Elden Beast, Malekith, Fire Giant, etc. They just do way too much damage otherwise. I know what you're thinking too, based on the footage, of course he's taking a ton of damage, he's wearing robes, not armor. Well, here I am in a full set of knight armor. It doesn't really matter. In all of my experience with these games, I have never felt that I needed more than 25 vigor in order to make it through the entirety of the game. But in Elden Ring, I felt completely helpless unless I had at least 45 vigor for the final bosses. This is, of course, helped by the massive number of levels that the player is likely to obtain throughout their playthrough, but it still feels ridiculous to be getting one shot by bosses with 40 plus of my levels invested into health. This problem is only exacerbated by the sheer size of some of these bosses. In many cases, it's impossible to even see what they're doing before they unleash the damage, and this only leads to frustration when being hit by an attack whose telegraph wasn't visible due to camera constraints. Overall, I think that while many of the boss designs are visually remarkable in this game, I don't believe that they are the best in the series, especially in the latter half of the game. This is such a shame too, because as we have already discussed, the areas that they reside in are some of the best designed levels in the game. On top of these overly tuned damage numbers, some of the hitboxes feel really janky sometimes, especially on grab attacks, which are always terrible. These games would genuinely be better experiences if they just eliminated those entirely. Overall, the combat is really great for about the first half of the game, even if many of these encounters are harmed by boss reuse in later levels. As a final side note to this section, and something that really bothered me about the game, is the way they handled the Great Runes. These are sold as monumental items, pieces of the shattered Elden Ring, and are supposedly used to wield immense amounts of power. The problem is that they don't feel that way at all. I never felt the need to use any Great Rune, but the one received from defeating Godric, because it increases all of the character stats by 5 each. This effectively increases the player's level by 40. No other Great Rune in the game came even close to matching the benefits this provided. It really is a shame that what had the potential to be really cool rewards for beating the Elden Lords were so disappointing after the very first one. Overall, this game had remarkable boss visuals, but some of the actual mechanics and the damage that they each dealt were just on a whole different level, and oftentimes one that wasn't much fun to engage in combat against. Speaking of combat, it's mostly really good, except for of course the complaints that I had in the previous section. Different from the enemy designs, there's an immense amount of weapon and spell variety to be found within the game, plenty of interesting talismans to fit any build, and a wide array of spirit ashes to be summoned into battle. The combat is generally pretty similar to any other FromSoft game, albeit set in an open world. That being said, there are still a fair number of problems with the systems, especially with regards to balancing. This is of course the result of all the variety that the game has in terms of combat options. Across my 3 playthroughs, my characters had builds focused on faith, intelligence, and dexterity. The problem is that all 3 of them narrowed incredibly in spite of how many options my characters had. What I mean by narrowing is that my characters each found a broken strategy naturally throughout playing and rarely faltered from that in favor of the immense amount of options at their disposal. For example, my first character almost exclusively focused on landing Scarlet Rot on bosses and surviving while safely landing hits when possible with my ranged Halo sight. This strategy, while kind of boring, worked incredibly well, until it didn't. You see, the final few bosses of the game are highly resistant or immune to Scarlet Rot and bleed buildup, almost completely resist holy damage, and are incredibly tanky, as I've discussed previously. In fact, this problem was so ridiculous that I had to completely alter my build for the final fight because the strategy that I had used until this point was completely unviable. By the way, when I say that it didn't do enough damage to be viable, what I mean to say is that my weapon was doing about 1/3 of its total damage in holy damage, and that both stages of the final boss resist a whopping 80% of holy damage. Not to mention the fact that my Halo Sight's weapon art dealt exclusively holy damage. This means that my weapon essentially had its damage cut by about 1/3, and none of my spells were useful either. My build was no longer capable of defeating the final 2 bosses of the game, and I was forced to respec my character or upgrade a different weapon and abandon my spells. I don't have a problem with certain bosses resisting certain things. In fact, I think it is healthy for that to be the case, because it makes certain builds more or less viable against certain bosses, and incentivizes multiple playthroughs or testing various different strategies. However, it is a problem when my build is rendered legitimately incapable of dealing damage to the final boss when it has been perfectly fine up until that point. So maybe these sorts of balancing issues are just a coincidence and aren't indicative of a wider problem with the game? That's what I thought too, until I started my second character, a mage. In this playthrough, I ran into a completely separate problem, this time related to spells. Of course, knowing where everything was this time, I ran straight to the cave on the edge of Caelid and retrieved the Moonveil. From this point on, I never felt any need to use my spells except for a select few moments. They were quite literally always overshadowed by the power of Moonveil's weapon art and its ability to inflict bleed. Even against the final boss, I ran into very little difficulty and pretty much ran through the entire game with little to no issues. My third playthrough was taking the character into NG+, mostly because I wanted the Platinum Trophy, but also because I was curious how busted power stancing katanas would feel. And it felt completely broken. I believe that I managed to run through the required bosses in under 2 hours on this NG+ character and only died a handful of times. In my experience, and from what I've seen from the community, bleed damage and katanas are far and away the most unbalanced part of this game, and I could see that very distinctly in my second and third runs through the game. It was genuinely so bad that my second intelligence-based character never felt the need to cast spells, with the exception of the fight against Melania, a single time throughout the playthrough. These games have always had weapons or methods of play that made them drastically easier, but wanting to be a spellcaster and never feeling the need to use magic because Moonveil just inherently does more damage than multiple hits of all of my spells removes the desire to experiment with magic. The second aspect of combat that I'd like to touch on is Spirit Ashes. I think that they're an interesting and unique addition to the game. They make it easier than ever to summon someone to aid you in combat. My problem with them, however, is that the game is tuned around the player using Spirit Ashes. Sometimes. This may not sound like a problem at first, but for players who want a more traditional Souls-like experience, it is, because the bosses are crafted around the expectation that players will use Summon Ashes. This is why bosses do an egregious amount of damage and have obscenely large health pools, because the game expects you to use Spirit Ashes in boss fights. Ideally, Spirit Summons would feel like an optional buff when fights become too difficult, but the reality is that many of the fights feel ridiculous and unfair without them. This is due to a variety of factors, but the main one is that bosses simply don't know how to respond when there are two targets. Having a summon makes finding time to heal, cast spells, throw consumables, sneak in hits, etc. so much easier, and since the bosses are designed around the player always having a summon, they feel much worse to fight alone. On the flip side, bosses sometimes don't feel at all tuned around the player using Spirit Summons, and are completely trivialized by using them. For example, here are a few clips of my NG+ character getting destroyed by Moog, Lord of Blood. Now, here's how the fight went when I summoned my Mimic Tier Ashes. Yeah, they really break the combat that much. These games have always been heavily impacted by summoning NPCs or friends to aid you in boss fights, but these Spirit Summons were tested so little before release that Mimic Tier was literally able to solo defeat bosses for you when the game came out. Even now, after being nerfed heavily, it feels pretty busted. So yeah, Spirit Summons are a really cool addition, but they have a ton of balancing issues that need to be resolved. The final thing that I want to discuss with regards to the combat of this game is a double-edged sword: Torrent. In many ways, Torrent is one of the very best additions to this game. He feels magnificent to ride, easy to control, and combat on him is for the most part pretty good compared to horse combat in most games. That being said, he's not a perfect addition because of the lack of a dodge that provides iframes. For anyone who doesn't know, iframes are what allow a player to dash or roll through an attack without taking any damage. Torrent has nothing like this, which means that against enemies for which Torrent is meant to be ridden, he can sometimes be caught helpless against attacks that smash down or sweep through it. This could be easily fixed by giving him a designated button for a quick dash or by giving his jump iframes. I know it might seem silly that he'd be able to jump through something slamming on top of him, but it's no sillier than us rolling through the fire of a dragon and coming out unscathed. Plus, this couldn't possibly be a worse solution than letting the player die like this. There are other things that I can't believe From Software didn't implement for Torrent, things like armor to give him extra health or a charge attack to run over weaker enemies. Also, the fact that he can't be summoned and ridden against certain late game bosses, Elden Beast especially, must be a mistake, because the fight would be so dramatically improved by that kind of mobility. Not only would it alleviate the struggle of Elden Beast moving around the arena like it did with the dragon fights around the world, but it would also tie together the feeling that Torrent was connected to you, a part of our journey, and with us to the end. Again, I think that Torrent was an excellent inclusion, especially for exploration. He allowed them to build the world with a more vertical and complex level design. However, he needs some additional features and touch-ups in whatever their next project is, should they continue to include him. Elden Ring is an amazing game, and certainly the best to come out so far this year. I don't want my reception of the game to come off as more negative than I actually feel, but I do think that it's really important to call out imperfections even in things that we love. Elden Ring is not a perfect game, but it is an excellent one. From Software managed to create a more compelling world on their first try than most open world games have ever come close to. It is the first open world game that I can say has great combat, and it in many ways took the revolutionary foundation that Breath of the Wild laid out and improved upon it in nearly every way. The music too, man, the music is just so incredible. I love the moment when the main menu's music kicks in during the final fight and you finally realize just how powerful it is in the score. The main menu feels different after you beat the game because of that reframing of the song's meaning. In a lot of ways, I think that this game sacrificed quality for quantity, or simply ran out of steam in the later half of development. But the core idea is there, and I'm definitely excited to see what comes of their games moving forward. The thing that makes FromSoft so special is that they refuse to become stagnant. While many of their games share a common DNA, they always have different skeletons, and I can't wait to see what's in store for us in the future. Let me know what you all think in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.